Well, first, let me explain what is SAW. SAW stands for summarize, analyze, and work out the details. SAW is a very powerful method to solve almost all calculation problems in science, including chemistry. Well, you may wonder, Dr. H, why do we want to use SAW? Well, let me briefly explain. First, in science, mathematical equations are used to represent relationships between different variables. For example, the volume of a cubic object and its edge length are related by volume is equal to edge length cubed. The relationship between the density, volume, and mass of a substance can be represented by density is equal to mass over volume. The relationship between the mass, molecular weight, and moles of a chemical can be represented by mass is equal to molecular weight times moles. Number 2. There are only limited number of mathematical equations and limited number of variables in science. This sounds like good news for the students because it seems you do not need to learn much. However, the limited number of mathematical equations and the limited number of variables can form a very complex network. This sounds like bad news for the students because there are so many different ways to relate the limited number of variables with limited number of mathematical equations. Well, if we realize the variables and the relationships on a piece of paper, it will look like a map. In the map, each intersection can be a variable. The line between adjacent intersections can be a mathematical equation. Two variables may not be linked by a single equation directly. Well, let's look at this map. As I just mentioned, each intersection can represent a variable. Each line between adjacent intersections can be a mathematical equation. Some variables are linked by a single mathematical equation. Some variables may not be linked by a single mathematical equation directly. However, they are not independent of each other. They can be related by several mathematical equations. Number 3. In a college classroom, a student will be taught each mathematical equation within a subject, and the instructor may demonstrate how to calculate one variable from another. The variables may or may not be linked by one single equation. An instructor cannot demonstrate all possibilities because there are so many relationships between different variables. There is not enough time for an instructor to demonstrate all of them. However, in a rigorous program, a student is expected to have the ability to start from any variable, pick appropriate equations to navigate through the network to find any other variable. SAW can help you to achieve this purpose relatively easily. This is the major goal of college education. However, there are some common misunderstandings about the goal of college education. Some students mistakenly think that to calculate variables with a single mathematical equation is A work. This is wrong. This is just a C work at most. In some rigorous program, master the single mathematical equation calculations is just a D work. Well, the next question you may have is how to use SAW. Now let me explain. The prerequisite to use SAW is you have to master the mathematical relationships really well. What do you mean, really well? Let me use an example to explain. Really well means if you are given the molecular formula of a chemical, you will immediately know that, first, you can calculate the molecular weight. Second, you also know how many moles of each element in 1 mole of the chemical. Third, you also know how to calculate the mass percentage of each element. Fourth, you also know the empirical formula. If you are given the molecular formula of a chemical, if you can recall, you can do these 4 different things from the molecular formula. That means you know it really well. If you cannot recall the above, you will have a difficulty to use SAW. You will also struggle for a C. Now let me explain the steps to use SAW. There are 3 steps to solve a calculation problem using SAW. The first step is to summarize the most important information. Generally, the most important information includes numbers with units, what we are looking for, and balanced chemical equations. But I want to let you know, not every problem will have balanced chemical equations. Therefore, for some problems, the summary only includes 2 different kinds of information. The second step is to find a path from what we are given to what we are looking for. This step depends on how many relationships you can recall from what we are given. The third step is to work out the details of all steps. The second step is most challenging. My suggestions to use SAW is master the simple equations by practicing simple problems repeatedly. Then you start to practice using SAW to solve a complex problem.